started, my name is Tabitha Scoble. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Historical Society. We have a new book coming out, and we are going to be selling ads for that. I have a flyer right here. There's a special for the month of October. I put more flyers on the back table, and it doesn't have to be a business or organization. You can do ads that commemorate a loved one or something like that. But the book is going to be the last 60 years of Cortland County history. It's going to be a really nice book. It's got, here they tell us, over 2,000 photos collected at this point. They're trying to winnow that down a little bit, but it's going to be a really nice book. And next week, we do have another Lunch and Learn. It is early cobblestone construction, and we'd like to see you at that one as well, if you can attend. But today's is Dave Fuller talking about Lee Kibbe, who was his grandfather. And I've heard all kinds of stories about Lee. He's sort of locally infamous. And I just told Dave that when we were pulling our metal sheeting off our garage roof, we found a stamp, like a stencil, that was Lee Kibbe, that he must have sold the material to the Halbert family when they built the house, or built the garage. So,
actually, it would have been, he would have, standing seam, you have a press to put it in and then put it on. That was one of his functions.
Okay, very good.
So he put on the roof.
There we go. So, one more tie to Mr. Dave Fuller. All right. Thank you for coming, Dave.
Thank you. Been here before, and I was very pleased with the reception I had last time, so I hope you'll tolerate my voice a little bit. I'm a little bit scratchy today. Long time ago, the powers to be decided that the town of Solon was too big. So they divided it up. And part of it went to Truxton, part of it went to Freetown, I think, and then the entire township of Taylor came out of it. And that was named Taylor after Zachary Taylor, obviously, or not obviously, but factually. So the people back then did have a sense of reason. They didn't name the pond Taylor Pond, they named it, left it Solon Pond. So they didn't really mess it up so much, but Solon Pond, it was a natural wet area, and it was swampy, and they built a dam. And if you're familiar with the area at all, you come down Solon Pond Road, there's a road that goes up over the hill to Swartz Road, and then you go around on the Solon Pond Road, and there's a road that goes up the hill. It's called Potter Hill. Potter Hill, when you get to Potter Hill, the first mill was right there. And the only resemblance of that being a facility of some type is a cheese factory that is still there. It was a cheese factory and a gristmill sawmill. The gristmill sawmill burnt, gone, and Lee Kibbe entered the scene. He bought Solon Pond and 5 acres. But the 5 acres was on the south side of Potter Hill. And that's where he built the mill that made him rather stand out in the community. That's just one of the things that made him stand out. The cheese factory, as I said, is still sitting there. It's across from what used to be Pudney's store, where Roy and Sharon Ellis live now. Lee was born 9 December 1881. And he died 15 December 1961. Take those two, his birth and his death, 1881, 1881. He died in 1961. 80 years later. The next time that comes up is a long time down in the future. We won't be around to witness it. At the age of 80, he had a heart attack. He called my mother, said, "I'm not feeling well, I need to go to the hospital." She says, "I'll call the ambulance." He says, "No, come up here, you can drive me in." She drove him in, and he died before noon. I was working in Cortland at the time, and I went into the hospital right after lunch, and he had died. He's buried in Cincinnatus, and his tombstone is an 1,800-pound millstone, grist millstone. How many of you know what that looks like? Oh, wonderful. Those that don't, it's a big brown thing with slats cut in it.
Yep.
And if you go to Cincinnatus and go over to the Baptist Ave and behind the Baptist church, look way up on top of the hill, there's a big millstone up there. And that was one of the millstones out of the pond, out of this. Lee was married and had 7 daughters and 2 sons. One son died after 3 days of being with us, or with the family. Lee's done many things in his lifetime, and there have been stories written and told about him, some true, some not so true, but all of them testifying to the fact that he was a well-known character. From the horse and buggy days until Lee's death, he never owned or drove a vehicle newer than 1921. And he had the 1921 still in the garage. He called it a barn. And it was a Studebaker. And it was the only vehicle that he ever owned that wasn't a Ford. Right up until he died, he drove his 1914 Ford. He had a 1919 that he was driving, and he was over in the Sydney area someplace. Somebody offered him an outrageous price for it. I remember him coming home, or he called. We went and got him and brought him back. He said, "Got an outrageous price for it, $300. That was a few years ago, though.
Yeah.
Lee bought the pond and the mill for the 5 acres where the mill and the entrance down out of the mill. He was the only one that had water rights to the water. Anybody else that wanted to go on it and fish had to pay for a permit. And there was 2 places to get the permit, and one was to go to Lee Kibbe's residence and try to find him. The other was to come down to my family's house and get a permit from us. They were expensive. It was $1 a day or $5 for the year. The sawmill was built on the ground level, and the grist mill was on the 2nd floor, and the residence where he raised 8 children was on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor consisted of, as you walked in, is this room that goes all the way to the back. That's the family room. And there was a bedroom, pantry, and another bedroom. And that was the outlay. The heat for that was a huge stove. When, I don't know, Home Comfort I think it was, but I wouldn't swear that. It was a chrome, black, and white, huge unit, probably bigger, about the size of this table. I'll get to that, go back to that stove later. But the large room that was used for cooking, eating, and other activities like bathing. I remember the tub was in the back corner, the bathtub. And it wasn't round, it was cone shaped. So, the second floor was the grist mill and workshop. Now the grist mill was this huge thing that you poured wheat or corn or whatever you were grinding into this chute, and it would go between these two stones, the top stone turning, and it would come out as powder. And the kitchen, or the house right above it, residence, the floor was always cleaned with sawdust because water couldn't go down through into the grist mill. So Mother tells about we had to go down and get a bucket of sawdust to sweep the floor. But the sawmill was rather unique also. Most sawmills that you see in the pictures and stuff have this big wheel on the side where the water runs down over it. Lee's didn't. Lee's were horizontal. The water went through it. And when he wanted to get power from it, he would shut the gate so that it would be going into the tunnel and go and power as it ran by the fins. Powered this thing. In my barn, because they were horizontal, there was a shaft that went up through the floor, and there was this huge wheel, belt, about this wide, about like that. It's up in my barn. That was at the top, and that's what started turning. Very slow, and then pick up speed. And it didn't slow down quickly. Once it got going full blast, he could zip right through some pretty good sized logs without slowing it down. So there was 3 wheels. One to saw, a smaller one to run the grist mill and to run the slab cutter and the plane. And then there was a small wheel, and this small wheel, when I'm talking small, I'm talking about like this with a chute on it. That was designed and manufactured by Lee to bring the slab wood, which was always, it's on a slant like this, and the bottom of it is where the slab wood and sawdust went from the sawing. And to get the slab wood up to the 3rd floor, actually it'd be 4 floors, to heat the stove and to heat the house. When the kids grew up large enough so that they were leaving home, Lee designed this apparatus with a 55-gallon drum, go down through, drop through the gates, and then he would fill it up with slab wood, turn the water wheel on, and get it going, and the slab wood would come up. I'll go back to that in a minute. My dad, and some of you may remember, a 1954 Dodge. In that year time frame, Chrysler products had what they call fluid drive. Fluid drive meant that you could shift, or you could put it into third gear and just step on the gas and it would shift automatically. This was the beginning of the automatic transmissions, sort of. Because we were going someplace, I don't really know where, don't remember, but we pulled out, backed out of the driveway, and my dad said, "Look at this, Lee," and he put the car into third gear and stepped on the gas, and it shifted going up over the hill and out of, headed towards Taylor. And Lee started in, "Those city folks, they've designed these so that because they're too lazy to shift." And my mother, who, bless her heart, she was a wonderful person, and I truly, I've heard her tell stories about Lee that would shock most of us. But she said, "Dad, let me tell you something. How many times have you shifted your Model T?" Then she said, "And how many times have you thought about us kids bringing up the slab wood and you making that thing? Took you 2 years to make it, so that you didn't have to go bring up slab wood." And he didn't say anything, which was extremely unusual for quite some time. But my mother would not hesitate to, most people did, hesitated to correct me, but my mother never did. Lee used the little wheel that once he got that going. He used the little wheel also to generate DC electricity and store it into batteries. And all the lights in the sawmill and everything were DC. They weren't alternating current, they were direct current, stored in batteries, and they would provide the light. When they'd start to get down, he'd open the wheel, recharge it. He shared that electricity, even though it was DC, with the Grange Hall, which was adjacent to his property. And the Grangers were very thankful. He didn't charge them. He said, "When you have a meeting, let me know. I'll turn the power on. But I'm going to shut the power off at 10 o'clock. And he did. Power was off. If you weren't done your meeting, too bad. And that was one of the things that the Grangers griped about quite a bit. Very seldom did they go past 10 o'clock. Another story I'll share with you about Lee. I was town supervisor in Taylor for a period of 10 years. And we were getting the building ready for our first trial, judiciary trial coming up that we'd had in years. We'd never had one while and we were making sure that the facility was capable and prepared for this jury trial that was coming up. And one of the supervisors, or one of the board members says, "You know, Dave, I think this is the first time we've had a trial jury since your grandfather was convicted." And I hadn't thought of it in that vein, but one day Lee had enough of the neighbor's dog chasing his milk cow. And he was very upset about it because the milk cow was not giving enough milk because she was being chased by this dog. So he went and got a shotgun. It was a double-barreled, hung right over the stairs to go out of the house down into the grist mill, hung right there. I remember. Anyways, he got and he popped it open. Yeah, there's shells in it. Came up, aimed at the dog, shot the dog, thought it was rock salt. It wasn't, it was lead. Killed the dog, and the neighbor filed charges against him, and he was convicted of killing the neighbor's dog. He had to make some type of restitution. I'm not sure exactly what kind, but it cost him a little bit of friendship amongst a couple of the neighbors. So that's the time that Lee got in trouble. He was a justice at one point. He was a town justice even. So Lee shot the dog, and the dog died. And Clayton Smith, I don't know if any of you ever, he directly related to the Pudneys. Clayton was my bus driver when I was a little guy. There was a doctor, sort of a doctor, he was called doctor. He was a medicine man, an Indian, that traveled around the communities healing. I mean, he was a trained doctor. I mean, he wasn't just a medicine man with Indian technique, but he was a educated doctor. He was traveling around, and he was a big boy, apparently, because I've heard my grandfather say when he'd come up to the Pudney store, they would put two pickle barrels together and a plank between them, because he was so big that he hung over in a chair, or he couldn't get into a chair that had arms. So they put him on pickle barrels and a plank. Anyways, he died. And he was in the area of Taylor when he died. And he's buried in Taylor. If you know where McKee Road and the McKee Cemetery is, he's not in the McKee Cemetery. He's about 200 feet southeast of the cemetery. Couldn't be buried in the cemetery because he was a heathen, and it was sanctified ground. So, enough about the doctor. Lee was a worker and a tinker. Now you just heard Tabitha. One of the things he did, and you've seen him, I'm sure, maybe not knowing what they are, standing seam roofs. A sheet of metal about that wide with a ridge standing up, and a sheet of metal and a ridge standing up. And they're not nailed to the boards. There's no nails. They're just there. And then they're nailed down on the sides. And they stay. Because they're folded over. That standing seam, there's a fold. And I've never seen it done. I don't want to know how it's done. But it's a very substantial roof. You will drive around the countryside and you look up. I came down into Taylor. I do it many times off of Whitney Road, come down into Taylor. And there was a standing seam roof. And I said, I never noticed that. Then the Taylor, where used to be the store in Taylor, standing seam roof. And I looked around, and there was only a couple of roofs that weren't standing seam, right in the hamlet of Taylor. And I'm sure Lee, and Tabitha brought that up, that there was it looks like it was painted.
Looks like a stencil.
I've never known one of them before, but Lee tinkered with everything. The standing seam roofs was one of the things that he did. Another thing that he did was he moved buildings. I sat and watched as he jacked up. I'm going to bring you back down into Taylor again. The Wesleyan Methodist Church, he jacked it up enough so that they could bring a bulldozer in underneath. They bulldozed out, laid a foundation, cement block foundation, poured a cement floor. Lee came in, lowered the church back down onto the foundation that they had planned, and now they have a full basement under the church. The church in Solon Pond, up there by the pond, was moved. I have no idea why. It was about 6 or 7 feet in one direction. Had no idea why. But Hugh Comfort, over on Taylor Valley Road, where he grew up, said one day he was out in the yard and he heard something coming, and he looked, and it was Lee Kibbe with his Model T, and he had jacked up the schoolhouse that we used to be up on Taylor Valley Road, up in the where there's a turnaround. Plows turn around and stuff. The town of Taylor still owns that, just a little bit less than an acre where the school was, because Lee had moved the school and it didn't get sold when the rest of the schools did. But he was coming down the road with his Model T with the school behind him. And he took it down into Taylor, and if you come into Taylor and you head towards Pitcher, there's 3 houses. The 3rd house is the old schoolhouse. And that's where Lee took it to and dropped it off. It was John Hires at the time. So he did a lot of things. If something broke, he would fix it. Maybe not the way it should be fixed by most standards. We had an old refrigerator like that. There was a handle that you pulled. Door opened, there was a little ice box in the center. Some of you may remember them. Well, Mom opened it up one day and the handle came right off in her hand. And you couldn't get into the refrigerator except by putting a pair of pliers on this little thing that stuck out about this far. And it had a hole in it. And that pin is broken. Lee was there and he says, I may be able to fix that. He went out in his truck. Now, his truck is Model T. And got some wood putty. Glob about that big. Played with it. Went over to the refrigerator, molded it onto that little tab. Said, now let it dry. Mom, I remember Mom saying, well, how long will it be? She says, I got to get supper. He says, give it 10 minutes and then you can, you can still see her fingerprints on that thing if you can find the door. She opened it about 10 minutes later. And that, I mean, I was like this at the time. And when I went into service at 19, it was still in the kitchen with still a little tab to pull. My aunt and uncle was in a horrendous accident over in McGraw, and my uncle was out of the hospital, but in a wheelchair, and he was staying with us. And our old house, farmhouse, had board floors, and we decided to put in hardwood floors. So we hired a guy to come in and he put in hardwood floors. But before he did that, my uncle used to be able to sit in the kitchen in his wheelchair, coast in through the dining room, up through the living room and into the bedroom without giving it a push. So, needless to say, our floors weren't level. And when they leveled them, where the beams were and where the old house was and then the additions that were put on, these beams and stuff would say, it's, you know how it goes. Well, the door between the kitchen and the dining room was a 6.5-foot door when it started. And when the floor was level, and Uncle Harold had to go like this, the door was 5 foot. 5, was it 5'6", 5'6", 5'7", and that was it. And I've got a cousin that's 6'9", and he came in, you know, so Mom says, we got to do something. Lee, what can you do? And he says, well, and he got out his ruler. And he always had one of these. And this is one of his. Pulled it out of his pants, went and started measuring, and went out to his truck, his Model T, came back with a board, made some marks on it, went back outside, could hear him sawing in the woodshed. Came in and he took a saw and cut an arch right in the wall and said, okay. Now it was 6'2". I think it's 6'2". In the center, because it's arch. And he took the board that he had prepared, it was 1/4 inch, and he flexed it. He said, yeah, that's good. He put it in this corner over here, pushed up like this, went like that, and it went right in. And there it sat. Wow. Then we could go in and out without ducking. Larry still had to duck. But if you stop and see the town justice at his residence, look at the door that going out of the kitchen into the dining room, and you'll find a nice little arch that's 6'2". So he would do things like that, and they last. Now, the house where Tabitha lived, hopes to live very shortly again, was built back in...
The oldest part's 1830.
That was before Lee. But the garage where she found these markings, when was it done? And you'll find that, I know the garage at the residence where I grew up, 2-car garage, collapsed. It was done on 2x4s, and it just, at some point, collapsed. It's still there. But the roof that my grandfather put on it is still there and in perfect condition. You could jack the roof out, put beams under it, and go back to work with it. But Lee had one of those with him all the time. I never saw him, and I saw him pull it out time after time after time. gonna tell a story now. Lee, when he would come down, and he came down very often at mealtime. When he'd get ready to leave, he would say, who's going to do it tonight? And of course, Don and I would both race. Don's my brother. Both race out to the Model T to grab the crank because we wanted to crank the Model T. And so this unique little car was so unique, and we rode in it. You know, he'd take us someplace and we'd ride with him, and so we were familiar with it. And one day, Mom, Dad, Lee, and younger sister, who would have told on us, left. They were going to be gone for quite a while. I don't know where they went. I couldn't tell you. But Don and I went out, and Don got in the driver's seat. I cranked it, and we drove around. We had a driveway that went around. Drove around twice. We put stones exactly where it had been parked. And we parked it back there after driving it around twice. And my brother drove it. I didn't. I just rode. That was enough for me. And we swept. We swept the tracks away. You know, we'd read too many westerns. And the only tracks that we left was right where the car, in the car, under the car. Because we did it back and front. We should have only done the front. But anyways, I don't think Lee ever knew. He never said anything if he did know. My mother, when she found out though, we did know the difference between good and bad, wrong, good and bad. Lee, at about 70 years old, started making a lot of trips to Sydney. Didn't really know why, didn't really care. But one day he came back and he says, I met this young lady and we're going to get married. Grandpa, you're 70 years old. He says, so isn't she? And I said, okay. Well, Mom invited her and him over, and she drove in her 39 Packard. Lee was riding. And we had dinner, and after dinner we were sitting around the table talking. And she said, yeah, she said, Lee will be my 5th husband. And I said, 5th husband? I'm sort of the, I speak out when I have a question. I don't hesitate too much. I said, what happened to the other 4? And she said, well, 2 died of heart attacks. So, she says, the other 2 were struck by lightning.
Oh my goodness. What are chances?
I've heard her tell the story about one of their husbands, when he was struck by lightning. They had a bunch of cows and a big old oak tree out in the middle of the pasture. And the cows, it started raining, thunder, lightning. The cows went underneath the tree. The husband went out to drive the cows away, out from under the tree, because it was nothing but a big lightning rod. And as he got there, the lightning struck it and killed him and all the cows. So, she shared that with us later on, but I said to Lee, I said, Grandpa, do you really want to marry this woman? She's outlived 4 husbands. She said, won't outlive me. She did. At 80, he died in December, and she died in the December of 61. She died in March of 62. So she did outlive him, but he died of a heart attack also. She was quite a lady. Lee's second marriage, told you, four families, 4 husbands, 4 families. Never really gave that much thought because we had a large family. I'm from, 7 sisters. My mother had 6 sisters, and I got cousins. My dad's the oldest of 5 kids, 6 kids. Got cousins coming out my ears, and everything. And I wasn't worried about her relatives other than us. It's sort of like me. I'm a Mason, and I was in lodge. I was master of the lodge down in Cincinnatus, and one night these 2 gentlemen came to visit, and they were introduced, and they were father and son from Delhi. The father had lived in Cincinnatus area, had driven milk truck, picked up milk cans. He'd driven school bus, and him and his brother ran a farm on the back road to Willett. So I said to him, I said, gee, you grew up in this area, or you was in this area quite a bit. I said, did you ever see a guy driving around in an old Model T? He said, you mean Lee Kibbe? And I said, yeah. It's kind of unusual that somebody knows Lee Kibbe by Lee Kibbe, not just Mr. Kibbe or Lee or the old man with the Model T. And I said, yeah, he's my grandfather. He said, mine too. And I said, how is that possible? He says, well, actually, Lee is my great-grandfather because his wife, his second wife, was my great-grandmother. And he's the oldest of 13 kids. Now I'm thinking, what a bank of relatives I've just opened up. Can you imagine? And they're from this area. I can't even imagine how many relatives I've got, and I have no idea. I do attend the Morley reunion now. That was Richard Morley was the individual that introduced me to the knowledge that I had, a whole bunch of relatives that I didn't know. So Richard and I stay in contact quite often, good friend of mine now. I stopped one day to see the commander of the Legion. I'm a member of the Legion, actually I'm the commander now, but somehow I keep getting these appointments. Anyways, past commander, and I had a couple of questions for him as the new commander coming in. He was at his dad's residence, which was up the Brackle a ways, and I said to him, because I didn't realize it until I was there, you could look right down and see the cemetery where Lee is buried off of the backyard of his dad's residence. And I said, geez, there's grandfather's gravestone. He said, oh yeah, he says, I helped him put it in. I said, you did? I said, how old were you? He said, oh, I was 9 or 10, I don't know. And I said, you didn't help, you watched. I said, but I've never figured out how Lee and my father, just the two of them, in our 2-wheel drive Chevy pickup truck, backed up that hill unloaded an 1,800-pound stone and moved it 3 lots over from the where you drive up. How that ever happened? And he said it was a bunch of apparatuses, tripods, and pulleys. You know, they pull it out and move it until they get it where he wanted it and placed it. I couldn't even imagine. They did it in November. My grandfather died in December. Anyways. Anytime I'm out and about and I stop at somebody's residence, I try not to let it happen around lunchtime or dinner time. When I was growing up, people called me Little Lee. And I used to be kind of objectionable to that term. But as I grew older, I realized it wasn't really something derogatory they were giving to me, but it was something that I should enjoy, being called Little Lee. And now, as I get to the age where I remember my grandfather from, I look in the mirror and very often Lee is looking back at me. I think I got most of his good traits. I hope I didn't get many of his bad traits. But Lee was particular in his food. And any place that he stopped, he would say, "What are you having for dinner?" Not that I would love to join you for dinner, but what are you having? And Mother always had pint cans of roast beef down in the basement on the shelves, you know. And when Lee'd come, she'd go get one, bring it up, because whatever we were having was wrong. And he spent several meals with us. And he'd tell stories. And I really wish I had listened and made notes to some of the stories, but I remember some of them quite vividly, and others, I talked to my sister, talked to my brother, they remember some other things, and I say, "Oh yeah, I remember that now." But Lee always told stories, and he narrated some pretty good stories. Lee was a jokester at times. I've given Tabitha some documents, but one of the things he did was over at Little York, we was having the foster reunion. My grandfather, Lee's mother was a foster. And it was at the foster reunion, and 2 twins, foster boys, had 2 Cadillacs. They were 52, one was a 52 and one was a 53 Cadillac. They were parked side by side with a car in between them. Lee came out, us kids were all out playing, and he came out and he said, "Whose car is that?" And we told him, whoever it was, I don't remember it. And he went away and he came back, and the guy came, got the car and moved it. Pretty soon here's Lee pulling in with his Model T right between the 2 Cadillacs. And then they had the business meeting later on, and us kids were outside, but I was told that Lee got up and said, "The Kibbe family is here, and some of us don't drive the Cadillacs, we drive the real vehicles, and we still got here." And the picture was taken, and it lives in my archives. In 1949, Lee wanted to have a family reunion, It's the only time, it's the only year that the entire family was together. And I've got 2 cousins that came after them, but that's another time. I've got a picture of that 1949 reunion held in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. Also have a picture of my grandfather standing by a clock that had wooden gears. I'm running overtime. I'm sorry. I had the same problem my grandfather did.
Wooden gears.
But the, oh, I'm sorry, wooden gears.
The clock.
Clock with a wooden.
Wooden gears, and it never was reset for the daylight saving time for those city slickers so they could sleep an extra hour and play an extra hour. Briefly about me, what I did, I was born right here in Cortland Hospital. My parents was working on the Zenadosha stock farm. Mother worked in the McGraw box. And then we bought a farm over in Taylor. I grew up in Taylor, graduated from Cincinnati, went in the Army for military intelligence for 23 years, traveled all over the world, literally, not figuratively. I have 2 children, 2 girls, and I have a lovely wife who was born and raised in Germany. And when I retired from the Army in '84, I became transportation supervisor at Cincinnati, was supervisor for 19 years, moved to Dryden, retired from Dryden as a town transportation supervisor, drove motor coach for 20 years for Swarthout. That's where I know you from. Drove motor coach for 20 years. I was town supervisor for 10 years, legislator for 4 years. I've been around, I've done a lot, I talk a lot, and I'll gladly answer any questions that you have. I do have, if anybody of you'd like to, picture of Lee and his clock, picture of the family reunion with this little guy in the stripes, the littlest guy in the striped shirt. That's me. And Lee's gravestone, out of Ripley's, believe it or not. So if anybody wants any of these, there's several here available. Questions?
Do you have any of the items that he made, the 10 items?
The 10 items.
I do. I'm glad you brought that up.
Here. I'm still going to have to read that.
I had 2 of these in my garage, and I never really thought about them too much until I had a cousin who's in Arkansas. Her husband collects antiques, and he called one night and he said, "Dave, you know I got the stove from up in the sawmill." Yeah, I did hear you somehow got it out of there. I have no idea how, but he bought it legally and transported it and rehabbed it in Arkansas, put it together, and he asked his wife, "Is this the original one that your mother's meals were cooked on when she lived there?" She said, "I have no idea." So I called you to find out. So I called my mother to find out. And she said, "Well, there's one way to tell. If the grate on the side where you'd open it up to let more air in has a wider place than smaller ones, it is the original stove, because Lee had it specially made so he could solder at night. You know, I don't know if you ever seen those big old soldering irons. You heat it up in the stove, and he had more than one, and he'd keep them heated, and he did solder work. This is one of them. I pulled these out. I'd had them in the garage for a long time. I pulled these out, and here was this. What the heck is that? Anybody want to take a guess?
Is it hollow?
It is.
Oh, I don't know.
And there was something in it.
Pencil box. Oh my goodness. It's a case for glasses.
Saturday night.
Metal plant.
Okay?
Were they his?
Yes.
Were they his glasses?
Oh, yeah. I never saw him with them on.
Did he wear those when he was soldering probably, or what? Are they?
No, I think, no. I don't know if he ever wore them. Like I said, I've never seen him with them on, but they were in the case that he made for glasses.
Wow.
And I had them at the Foster reunion. We was talking about them, and I was going through it, and one of the things got broke, but so be it. But he would, at night, he would cut the stuff out and get it bent. And then in the night, he would solder and they all fit. They still work. They're from the same stuff that those grills are made out of. Okay?
Did he make things like bread pans or coffee cups or?
I don't
bowls?
really know what all he did make. Those are the samples that I have.
He made candle snuffers, I remember.
Yes, and the candle holders
Yeah.
with the handle.
Did you know Porter Bennett?
I know the name, I didn't know him.
He has a son named Peter, and I thought that Peter Bennett had several pieces of tinware that Lee Kibbe had
He
made.
may have. I mean, Lee tinkered with everything. You name it, he did it just about. And if you go to my house, my brother, after I had got it done, my brother said, "Well, Lee, you did it again." I've got an overhead door that is extremely unique. And the only one that I showed it to Overhead Door Company. And they go, "Don't let anybody else know you can do that because we sell the expensive ones that I can't even, the door opener pulls the door up like this, along this track. Anyways, it's a Lee Kibbe modification of it. Any other questions?
Still wondering about the 53 Chrysler, whatever it was that the origin of the word shiftless?
It might have been. I don't know.
Or was there a shiftless before that?
Well, there was automatic cars before them, Power Glide, and, but the fluid drive was the only one that would switch back and forth.
How close were you growing up to his place?
I was 2 miles down the road.
Okay.
And I'm one of the very few people and I think I'm the only one that's alive, that knew how to start the saw. I never was allowed to use it, but he did
Right.
get me to be able to start it.
Oh. Did he put you to work? with
I
the
cut
law-
slabs.
Okay, yeah,
And tailed the saw and stacked the lumber.
yeah.
Did they cut ice out of the Solon Pond? Did they cut ice out of Solon Pond?
Absolutely. My mother tells stories about sitting in the schoolhouse and watching them cutting, and the horse fell into the
Oh, my
into the
goodness.
pond. And they got the horse out, rubbed it down, put a blanket on it, put it back out on. Yeah, they used to,
If anyone wants to see ice cut today, the Amish cut over on Lebanon Center Road in January and February. Yeah. Or Mennonites.
yeah, that,
But they use chainsaws today.
yeah, they were using the big
Oh, my goodness.
One handle this way, one handle this way,
Right.
like a hay saw. They'd use it for ice too. Or similar to it, I don't know exactly. I think it had smaller teeth than the hay. But it was,
Say how that works again. That kind of saw. But then,
there's a handle here
oh, yeah,
and a handle here. And it's just up and down,
oh,
just like you would with a
Crosscut.
crosscut saw, yeah.
oh.
And Don McCall has one at his house.
Oh,
See,
I never heard of that.
Well, they cut ice at Labrador Pond, so that's probably where he came into his.
When I taught school in McGraw, one of the men that, I guess he was one of the cleaners or something, I don't remember now what, but he used to tell about cutting ice on Little York Lake.
that was a big business.
Good ale pond.
Yeah. And he could recite poems. My God, they would have 30 stanzas and he could say the whole thing. And he-
My mother did recitations
Yeah.
and she was good at it.
People used to do that for entertainment, didn't they?
Yep.
And contests.
She says, Dave, I got a new one. Let me try it out on you.
Okay.
And so she was going through this recitation about going to the doctor's office for something. And he made her take all her clothes off and left her behind her clear and then put her on a cold table and, you know. And my wife
Did
was
you laugh?
sitting down at the other end of the table talking with my father, and suddenly she's tuning in. And she says, well, Mom, why did you let them do that? And but I always knew when Mother went into a recitation because her tone changed. She just, you could tell she was doing a recitation, or I could, because it just changed.
Are you gonna write a book?
Am I gonna, no. Okay, any other questions?